Hello, welcome to the taster lesson for A-Level Film Studies. I'm Mr. Hobbs. I'm one of the two teachers on the A-Level Film Studies course along with Mr. Ballantyne. And the point of the session today is basically to introduce you to what film studies is, and give you a bit of a taster of what it's like to study at A-Level. So we've got various things to go through today. Obviously, it's you're watching this virtually as a video, so just play this through. Obviously, pause it at certain points just to think about some of the things that we discuss. There are some videos embedded within this this presentation today for you to watch some video clips of certain films. So just watch it through, pause where you need to, and hopefully this will give you a really good idea of what film studies is like to study A-Level at South Hunsley. So in terms of what we're going to do today, first of all, we're going to just talk through what film studies is, and then we're going to think just generally about why you may want to study film, why people study film. We're going to have a look through some of the films that we study on the course, and then the bulk of the session is actually going to be looking at an introduction really of how we study film. So we've got 3 clips of films that we're going to be looking at today that hopefully will just give you a bit of an introduction to how we go about studying film and the kind of things we talk about and the kind of things that we discuss. Okay, so first of all then, I thought it's useful just to take you through the actual films that we study on the syllabus. So there are set films that you have to study across the 2 years of the course, and they're very varied, and they really do push you as a student to engage with films that you probably have never heard of before, and movements and genres of films that you've not really engaged with before. But you'll also notice on this list that there are some films I think that are a little bit more familiar to you, some genres that are a bit more familiar to you as well. However, you're still going to be engaging, discussing and studying those films and thinking about them in a way that perhaps you haven't really done so before. So it is a 2-year course, so we've got quite a few films to get through across the 2 years. So just to talk through the films that we have here. So you'll see that we have a unit called Classical and Contemporary Hollywood, which is a 2-film study unit, and it's a comparative study, which means we look at these 2 films together, and that is the classic Hollywood film of Casablanca from the early 1940s, one of the most famous films that's ever been made and one of my personal favourites. It's black and white, it's set and produced during World War II, and it's a sort of a thriller wartime romance with some classic scenes and some classic lines. We compare that film to a film from the late 60s, from a period of Hollywood that is known as New Hollywood, which is when Hollywood really changed the way that it produced films and moved towards becoming more the kind of film industry in Hollywood that we know today. The film we're looking at there is the classic New Hollywood film Bonnie and Clyde, a violent film, an exciting film, quite a sassy film for its time, but again one of my personal favourite films on the course as well. We then will also be looking at American films since 2005, so looking at some more modern Hollywood films, or actually not just Hollywood films, American films. So the first one we look at there is a Hollywood film. It's La La Land, so your traditional big budget Hollywood film, but a reinvention of the musical for the modern era. And I'm going to keep saying this, but again, one of my personal favourites on the course. The second film we study from American films since 2005 is actually an independent American film, so the opposite to a Hollywood film, low budget, gritty, dealing with some quite tough themes, and that is a film called Winter's Bone. We study a unit on documentary film, so a very different type of filmmaking, very specific, and the film that we study for that unit is the film Amy. So it's the documentary, biographical documentary of the singer Amy Winehouse. It's quite notorious, quite infamous, who died a very early death a few years back in her late 20s. So quite a tragic, sad documentary, a very good example of documentary filmmaking and done in quite a different way. We study British film as well. on the course. So we look at British films since 1995. Now, these are two films that quite often students are a little bit more familiar with. First film is This Is England. This is actually a social realist film, and it's a low budget British film, so dealing again with some quite gritty themes and filmed in quite a gritty, realistic way. But it does tend to be a film that actually quite a few students are reasonably familiar with. But again, we're going to be studying it in all sorts of levels and different angles and so on. And we studied that alongside, if you can believe it, Shaun of the Dead, which is probably the most, I suppose, one of the most commercial films that we do. It's known as a rom-zom-com, so a romantic zombie comedy, kind of like it's a parody, a pastiche of the horror zombie genre, and quite a popular film on the course. And again, probably the film that students are most familiar with. Then we study two different film movements, and I think this is where you are going to see films that perhaps you haven't seen before and wouldn't normally have engaged with. We first of all look at silent cinema as a film unit, and we study the film Sunrise from the 1920s, which is an example of a Hollywood take on German expressionism in the early 1920s. So a silent film, it's the earliest, the oldest film that we study on the course, but very interesting actually when you look at it. Fascinating to see films that are that old and see how they were made. The other film movement that we study is again a personal favourite of mine. It's the French New Wave film. So it's a film from the 1960s and from a period of French film history known as the New Wave. So very experimental, very modern, very different way of making film that emerged from that decade of the 1960s, where there are a lot of social changes. So it's black and white, it's foreign language, it's subtitles, it's very experimental, quite strange, but I think very, very interesting film, and I think visually a very interesting film to watch. And then finally we also look at other films from different parts of the world other than just the UK and the United States. So we have two films from elsewhere in the world to study in our global film unit. So we look at the Italian film Life is Beautiful from the late 90s. This is a film that is actually looks at the era of the World War II era in Italy and looks at the Holocaust, but does it from a comedy romantic perspective, which you might think is quite strange if you think about the Holocaust and that awful period of history. Well, Life is Beautiful actually looks at takes a very different take on it from other Holocaust films that you might have seen, and this, as I said, looks at it from a romantic slapstick kind of approach, which is very interesting. And then finally we look at a film from Argentina in South America, a film called Wild Tales. This is a film which is a film actually made up of 6 individual short films, but all on the theme of vengeance and done in quite a quirky kind of style. So those are the films that you can expect to study across the course. So quite a varied range of films for you there. And sorry, just one thing to add in here as well, just before I forget. There's also, which is important to note, a practical element to the film studies course too. So you can see the yellow box there explains that 30% of your mark will actually come from the practical screenwriting unit. So you will actually research screenwriting and study screenwriting, and you will actually create an idea for a short film for yourself, and you will actually write the full screenplay for that short film and also produce a digital storyboard for that short film as well. So that's 30% of the course mark comes from that practical unit. The rest comes from 2 exam papers that you will sit at the end of year 13. So I thought first of all it might just be useful for us, for me really, just to talk about why we study film. And I thought probably the best place to start is to sort of think about how I got into film, how I sort of found film as an engaging thing to study, and the first films that I kind of that really kind of engaged me when I was younger to want to study film and start to look at it in a way that was different to how I've been engaging with it up till then. So the 2 films that I've picked just to talk about here are a film called Schindler's List, which is a film that you may have heard of, a film by Steven Spielberg from the early 90s, but a very different type of film to anything he'd made before. Spielberg is known for the kind of big budget Hollywood blockbusters, this is a very different film for him, very affecting, very powerful film about the Holocaust in Europe. And then the other film that really sort of first saw me developing my interest in film is a French film from the 1960s called, in French, Le Parapluie de Cherbourg, which means the Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And it's actually a musical, but a French take, a French new wave take on a musical from the 60s. So a very interesting, different way of doing it to how Hollywood did it, and quite an unusual film that actually has gone on to influence the film La La Land that we study on the unit, on the course, sorry. So Schindler's List then, before I'm going to show you the trailer of it, but just to give a bit of background, Schindler's List, I saw this when I was a teenager and it went into cinemas, and I have to say it was the first time I went to see a film that really affected me, and the first time that I realised the impact that film could have on people at an emotional level, and the thought-provoking nature of film. I also thought this film was fascinating because of the way that it approached the creative decisions that had been made. It's filmed in black and white, so that's a decision that was made, but there are some little quirks within it where certain characters, famously there's a girl in a red coat that appears in the film, that is quite significant and quite moving when you spot this character in a red coat, and then later in the film you see the red coat amongst the rest of the black and white on a pile of bodies. So lots of decisions made that very creatively, very impactful, and I think it was the first film that I've been to see as a teenager that really had an impact on me and made me realise how powerful film could be. So we'll just have a look at the trailer for this.
By law, I have to tell you, sir, I'm a Jew. Well, I'm a German. So there we are.
You want these people?
My people, I want my people.
Who are you, Moses?
They say your factory is a haven. They say you are good.
Who says that?
Everyone.
All you have to do is tell me what it's worth to you. What's a person worth?
No. What's one worth to you?
Power is when we have every justification to kill. And we don't. The list is life.
Whoever saves one life saves the world entire.
Right, so the next film I want to talk to you about that really had an impact on me was the French musical The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Now, I first came across this film. It's from the 1960s, so I actually wasn't alive when it came out, but I came across it first when I was actually studying A-level French when I was at sixth form. So within my French A-level course, that's how I first really got introduced to the idea of film studies, because we had to study some French cinema as part of that course, and we actually studied the films of the New Wave, which is the movement we study on film studies, and we look at the Jean-Luc Godard film Vivre sa vie. But that introduction to French cinema really had an impact on me, and I'm fascinated by that movement of French cinema. And from that, I started a journey further in to French cinema, and as a teenager, as a 17, 18-year-old, and I came across this film, which was made by Jacques Demy during the 1960s, and kind of a French New Wave take on the big Hollywood musicals of the 50s and 60s, but from a French perspective. It's sung in entirety, so it's a fully sung musical, kind of like an operetta, I suppose, where everything is sung, every line of dialogue is sung. And obviously it's in French, but you watch it with subtitles. It's a beautiful film. Visually, it's just so beautiful. Cherbourg is basically a very dull, grey, slightly depressing port town on the north of the Normandy Peninsula in France. That could have cut off, not much going on there, and yet this film makes it look like a magical, bright place. It's also a very sad film, Umbrellas of Cherbourg. It doesn't go in the way that you think it will go. It doesn't have a happy Hollywood ending. It's a very French ending, and also it's gone on to influence La La Land, actually. Chazelle, the director writer of La La Land, was hugely influenced by the Umbrellas of Cherbourg and also a couple of other of the French musicals of the 1960s, and you can see that influence in La La Land as well. So this is the second film that really influenced me and got me into film studies and made me realise that film creatively, how film could look, how it could affect you with the visuals and the music and the sound and the aesthetics. This is one of my favourite films of all time.
Je ne pourrai jamais vivre sans toi. Je ne pourrai pas, ne pars pas, j'en mourrai. Je te cacherai et je te garderai. Mais mon amour ne me quitte pas.
Tu sais bien que ce n'est pas possible.
Je ne te quitterai
Mon amour, il faudra pourtant que je parte. Tu sauras que moi, je ne pense qu'à toi. Mais je sais que toi, tu m'attendras.
Okay, so on to the first activity that I want us to do, I want you to do now. I'm going to show you a clip of a film. It's not one of the films from our syllabus, it's a different film, and I'm not actually going to tell you which film it is at the moment. You may recognise it when you start watching it, but I want you to sort of go into this without any sort of preconceptions. The clip that I show you, what I would like you to do is think about the following and take notes as you watch. So I want you to think, as you watch this sequence, I want you to think how you feel watching it. What do you feel? What emotions do you have? What goes through your mind, and how do you experience this clip? And I want you to start thinking about why you feel that way. So I want you to understand how you feel, but as in film studies, what we do is we start to look at the way creatively the decisions that have been made by directors, producers, writers and so on, in order to affect the spectator, us. So I want you to think, okay, how do you feel? But then start to think why it is you feel that way. What has the director done creatively, visually, to the sound, the score, the images, the camera movements, everything you see in here, what has been done to make you feel that way? So try and write down some key examples of things you spot that have an effect on you, techniques that have been used, decisions that you can see that have been taken by the director and the producers and the screenwriters and so on to have an impact on us. There's a variety of things you might focus on. So think about what the camera does, think about how it does it, think about the colours you see, think about the performances you see, think about the sound. So that's the dialogue, it's the sound that you hear, is there a score playing over the top, is there not? What do you hear? So have a think about all these things and write down how this text, how this film has been constructed to be effective. Okay. Now, in terms of the clip, there are some parts of this clip that are a little bit gruesome. Not too bad, but you'll see as we start watching it. Just be prepared for that. But it is a famous film, and it is quite a powerful clip. So on the next thing we do is we'll watch through that clip, and you're going to take some notes about how you feel as you watch it, and some of the ways that you think you have been affected by the clip, and what decisions the director has done to affect you. Okay, so some of you may have recognised that as the opening sequence to the 1998 Hollywood film Saving Private Ryan, which was another film directed by Steven Spielberg, as was Schindler's List, but again yet another departure from his the kind of films he was most famous for. And this was a very impactful film and really did change, I think, the way that Hollywood represented war. War films up until then had been quite often quite clean films insofar as not really showing the horrors of war. This film really did change the way that war was showing the realities of war. There have been some exceptions with Hollywood film and war films prior to that, but I think this was for the modern generation was really kind of like a key film that could change some of the common descriptions of war, depictions of war in film. So hopefully you've had a chance to write down some of the ways that you felt affected by that sequence. You're quite free to go back and watch that again if you would like to take some more notes or go back and look at certain bits of it. What we're going to do now is I'm going to go through it with you next. We're going to watch it through and I'm going to just talk over the top of it. Just to give some ideas of the kind of things that we would look for in how this sequence has been constructed to affect the spectator. So, I think one of the first things to note here is the colours. It's very grey. It's got a grey hue over it, which basically means that the greys and the blues are very present here, and that gives a very significant feel to the film. It is cold, it is hard, emotionally quite a draining film to watch, and the colours kind of reflect that. It's you know. This shot here, the close-up of the hand shaking, straight away indicates to us the nerves that these young men were feeling, and they were young men, and this is what we then see as well as the camera starts to show the different characters on this boat. We see the very young age of a lot of them. You know, a lot of the people we see here are just teenagers. As the camera pans back, we see a character vomiting. That character's vomiting. Now that could be seasickness, but could also be nerves, couldn't it? Again, just showing how nervous they are. So notice there is no score throughout this sequence at all, which is unusual for Hollywood film. But you know, there is no dramatic, emotional score. It is just dialogue, and it's just the sounds, what we call the diegetic sounds of the landing beaches. And actually what I find quite interesting is the way that those sounds are quite dominant. It is difficult to hear the dialogue sometimes because of the noise of the waves and the gunfire, and again that obviously replicates kind of like what a wartime environment would really be like. Notice how we are focusing in close-ups on the faces of these individuals. They aren't characters who have names at the moment, but we're seeing the fear, the worry, the individual gestures they do. Look here as they are crossing themselves, kissing necklaces with crucifixes on. Now listen to this whistle. Look at the focus here as they start to go on the beaches, and look how immediately these characters are cut down. Now it's quite graphic the way that these poor young men are being shot. You know, we are seeing blood flying, we are seeing bits of bodies exploding. It's graphic, and it is trying to show that war is not clean. War is not heroic in a sort of a sense of just charging onto beaches and fighting. It's dirty, it's gruesome, it's violent, and it's shocking. Now this is interesting. Notice how we get the idea of perspective here. So obviously the camera seems to be, we're filmed from a perspective as though we are really there. As the camera now goes into the water along with these soldiers, and notice how the sound now muffles as well. We're now hearing the sound underwater as we're observing these quite horrific scenes of people being dragged down and drowning by the weight of their equipment and being shot under the water as the bullets fly through the water. Notice how the camera now merges, goes up, goes down. Again, gives that idea of perspective. We feel that we are there watching the film, watching the sequence, through somebody's eyes. It's very voyeuristic. Again, no score. It's all diegetic sounds of the actual of the beach itself and the battle zone itself. To hear about the sound of the bullets zipping past, clanging off of metal. It's not what we're kind of used to hearing or seeing in war films. And then look at what we call the kinetic feel of the camera work. The camera is moving, it's jolting. We know we're watching it through a camera. It's not smooth. it feels, it looks like we're seeing it through the eyes of a person or a camera that is being held there on the beach itself. We can see the movements of the camera, so it gives it a very realistic feel. It's very realist, this particular sequence, and you can see it the way we seem to be peeking through bits of metal, and the way that it's the composition of this sequence is quite lacks focus at certain points. And we can see here the point of view from the German gun points. It's as though we are looking through the eyes of a German soldier here. And framing wise, you know, we're not seeing perfectly framed shots here. People walking in front of cameras, we're seeing bits of people, you know, parts of them, and so on, rather than a full sequence. Again, this the perspective it cuts to occasionally just shows how sitting targets really these young men were, and now we see some quite horrific violence here. Obviously with the explosions, a poor man just lost his leg there. It's very graphic and it is shocking, but it is trying to show us war and the realities of war. Now again, really interesting thing with the sound here. Notice how the sound again cuts out. And that represents our protagonist's sense of shock here. You know, he's temporarily lost his hearing due to the explosions and the shock that he's in. Look at the performance on his face. He can't take in what he's seeing as he looks around these quite horrific scenes now. So people being burnt alive. I think we're going to see a poor young man with his leg that's been blown off in a second. Here we go, his arm, sorry, it's been blowing off. And he obviously in shock as he picks the limb off the floor. Horrific scenes that our protagonist is witnessing and the shock that he's in. And notice now how it then cuts to another character who appears to be shouting at our protagonist. And that will come in a second. Look at the water, how the water has just turned red with the blood. That really is quite shocking. So little details like that. And we can see the shock on his face. Now here we go, this character, we lip read, "What now, sir?" And we looked at, you know, people looking to him from instructions, but now the sound comes back in. He's still in shock, but now he has to respond. Now again, as I said, we notice here how the sound levels are not balanced, if you like. We're not hearing the dialogue in any more pronounced way than we are the gunfire and the waves and the explosions, and it just indicates how chaotic this environment is and how difficult it is to communicate. In a normal film you might expect to be hearing the dialogue quite clearly. It's actually very difficult to hear what people are saying because they are drowned out by the noise of battle and the sounds of the explosions and the general chaos that we're seeing here. And again, that's what I mean by composition as well. This feels very claustrophobic. The shots are very tight. So we see they're packed into that shot many faces. You know, the director Spielberg hasn't gone for lots of wide shots for us to view the beach as a whole. We're seeing it in quite a claustrophobic way, again to show how claustrophobic it feels. The only shots we really get a view of the whole beach are from the position of the German soldier there as they're gunning down the men on the beach, and again just highlighting how they're sitting targets. Here dialogue, this poor soldier here calling for his mother, some very horrific injuries. Again, just shows how effective people were and how shocking this was. What I would like you to do now then is actually have a look at a sequence from another film, and it's actually from La La Land, which is one of the films that we study on the syllabus, and it's part of the closing sequence to this film. And what we're going to see here is the end of the film, where actually Mia and Seb in the film don't get together. The protagonists that you can see in the poster there, their romance doesn't work out. They end up leaving each other. In this closing sequence though, Chazelle gives the audience a fantasy ending. He drops in a fantasy ending. So have a look at kind of how, again, this is constructed, how it makes us feel as a spectator, the techniques that are used. And I want you to think about what is different to Saving Private Ryan here. Ultimately, I would argue they have the same kind of intentions in some respects as affecting the audience, the spectator, making us feel something. But what we end up feeling, I think you'll see, is quite different, and how the films go about creating that is very different. And La La Land aesthetically is a very different film. So I'd like you to have a look at this sequence experience and feel about how it makes you feel as a spectator, what you think the intentions are of this film for the spectator. Think about those differences to La La Land, those differences to Saving Private Ryan, and just think generally about how actually this film this sequence is constructed, and what it is that the director has done to make us feel the way we do when we watch it.
Welcome to Seb's.
I just heard you play, and I want to...
Right, so that was part of the closing sequence for La La Land, and totally different to Saving Private Ryan. La La Land is a riot of colour, and it's escapism. And actually gives us there what you've seen is a fantasy ending where Chazelle has basically broken away from the actual narrative of the film, where Mia and Seb don't end up together, you know, that goes against the Hollywood ending, and actually slots in a fantasy ending for us where we can see how the story could have ended if they had stayed together before returning to the real ending where they have split up and are no longer together. Is it different to Saving Private Ryan? Absolutely. Okay, La La Land is about escapism. When I went to the cinema to see La La Land, it just took me off to a different place, and for 90 minutes, 2 hours, I was whisked away in a sort of a magical world where everything was bright and colourful and people burst into song. Saving Private Ryan, when I saw that at the cinema, was incredibly hard-hitting and thought-provoking. Both of those films had an impact on me. Both of them are supposed to have an impact on the spectator, but in different ways, and they go about doing it in different ways. So there are differences, but also there are similarities as well, which is kind of what we look at within film studies. We're looking at how that message, how that effect is made and got across the spectator, and what films mean, and we look at them in a deeper way to get a better understanding of them, and really do pull them apart, and that ultimately is what we do in film studies. One final part that I'd just like to talk about, just to take it a little bit deeper, because obviously what we've done today is look specifically at how we analyse the moving image and the sound of a film. We also look beyond just the films themselves, and we consider how the films fit into the worlds that they exist in. So I thought just briefly I'd try and give you an example by looking at James Bond films. We don't look at James Bond films on the A-level syllabus, but I think they're quite a good way to sort of show this idea of context and ideology. So context is what is going on in the world when a film is made, and ideology is the messages, beliefs and values that film communicate to the audiences. So if you look at Bond films, if you look over there, I've got a poster from 1963 from Russia with Love, and I've got a poster from 1981 for a Bond film called For Your Eyes Only. Now just notice in both of those posters, for example, look at the representation of women. Women are highly objectified in those earlier James Bond films. If you look at the poster for Your Eyes Only, there's something there called, that we refer to as dismemberment. The fact is that all we see is basically the bottom and a pair of legs of a woman. Okay, hence this term dismemberment. It's just the body parts, and what it's basically, how it's basically representing a woman there is for no reason other than sexual objectification. The woman has no face, she has no personality, she's not a named character. It's just about being sexually objectified from a male perspective. However, Bond, who's slotted between her legs, is prominent there. If we look at the From Russia with Love poster from the 60s, a similar idea. The women there on that poster are sexually objectified in the poses and the way that they are drawn on the poster. Bond is at the front. Bond is the one with the gun. Bond is the one who is the powerful protagonist. The women are just there really for window dressing and for the pleasure of the audience and the pleasure of Bond. If we jump forward though to 2006 and 2015 with the Daniel Craig part of the franchise, notice in 2006 in Daniel Craig's first film, Casino Royale, look how Bond now is sexually objectified. What we've actually got here is an intertextual reference to one of the first James Bond film, actually, Dr. No, where the Bond girl played by Ursula Andress came out of the sea in a bikini and was objectified by Bond, looked up and down by the audience and by Bond and sexually objectified. In Casino Royale, that scene is turned on its head, and it's Bond that emerges from the sea in a very similar way to Ursula Andress in Dr. No. But now the spectator and the female character in that scene objectify James Bond. We get to look at him and sexually objectify him as he emerges from the sea. It's interesting to see how Daniel Craig as an actor bulked up his body for that particular role and scene, for the purposes of the sexual objectification that was going to be taking place. Look at the film poster for Spectre from 2015 and note here how, although Bond is still at the front, the female character from the film is now much more prominent and is seen to appears more equal to Bond in terms of representation on that poster. So what you've got there is a good way to sort of show how a franchise like Bond can show and is affected by the social context of the time, to do with how gender roles are understood and the representation of women and how women are considered within society. You can see that change across the films as they've started to much more positively represent women, and also the way that things are almost turned around, and the sexual objectification that women used to have in films is now something actually that men seem to have happening more to them. And then finally, ideology, which is the messages and the values of the films. So Bond films have certain messages and values that people can read from them. And if you notice here, Matt Damon, who was starring in kind of the American take on Bond, their sort of version of it, the Bourne series, the Jason Bourne films, he actually is quite critical of the Bond films. He's denounced Bond as an imperialist and a misogynist. Imperialism is basically linked to empire and colonialism. So this idea that Bond is a British agent who goes around the world, parts of the world that quite often used to be controlled by Britain, imposing Britain's will on other countries. So this idea that actually it's quite an imperialist franchise of films. And misogynist means basically a very negative attitude towards women, and this criticism here that Bond, the way that he picks women up, sleeps with them, disposes of them, uses women, is very misogynistic. So that's a way that you can read Bond from quite a critical ideological perspective. So just some examples there of some other things that we discuss in film studies beyond just looking at the visuals of the films themselves. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our taster session for film today, albeit virtually. I hope you sort of got a good idea of kind of what it's like to study film at A-level and the kind of things we discuss and the kind of things we do. If you do have any questions about the course, please do get in touch with me, or if you want any more information about the course, you can obviously come speak to me in school, or you can email me. The contacts are there. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope you've got a good idea of film studies, and I really hope that you will opt to do the subject at A-level when you join us in September. Thank you.